I work part-time at a gas station on the edge of my city, near the suburbs. It's a pretty typical gas station. Not particularly creepy or isolated, just a place where people fill up their tanks and grab snacks. I took this job because rent prices were climbing, and my other job wasn't enough to cover the bills. The only shift that fit around my schedule was overnight, and gas stations are one of the few places offering those hours. This all happened about 10 months ago. It was a bitterly cold night, with patches of snow still clinging to the ground from a heavy downfall a few days prior. The night started off uneventfully, the way most nights do. Being in the suburbs, the gas station doesn't see much traffic during those hours, just the occasional car passing by. By midnight, only a handful of vehicles had stopped by, and the silence was heavy, pressing in on me as I worked. After a while, I got bored sitting at the front desk. I decided to stretch my legs and wandered into the shop to rearrange some items on the shelves, trying to make everything look presentable. It wasn't long before the quiet was broken by the sound of the door chime. I turned around to see a man walking in. He moved straight to the counter, leaning over it and glancing around like he was searching for someone. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, heading back to the counter. My voice seemed to startle him. He flinched slightly, turning to look at me with wide eyes. For a moment, he hesitated before shaking his head and mumbling, "No, I'm good," then walking out the door. Something about his behavior didn't sit right with me. His nervousness, the way he'd scanned the room, and his abrupt exit all felt off. My gut told me he'd wanted something he didn't get. As I watched him walk outside and climb into a car parked awkwardly near the pumps, not in a designated spot, my unease grew. The car lingered for a moment before pulling out of the lot and disappearing into the night. I couldn't shake the suspicion that he'd been scoping the place out. Maybe he'd planned to rob me, but seeing me away from the counter had thrown him off. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Working at a gas station, you hear stories, robberies, assaults. It's always in the back of your mind. I decided not to take any chances. I called the police, reporting the strange interaction and describing the man and his car. They told me an officer would swing by in a few minutes to take a statement. I hung up, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But then, not even a minute later, the same car pulled back into the lot. My stomach dropped. Parked in the exact same spot, engine running, and this time I was certain I saw movement in both front seats. There were at least 2 people in the car. My pulse quickened as I locked the doors, my hands shaking. They didn't get out. They just sat there, waiting, watching. The seconds felt like hours as I stared at the car from behind the counter, trying to decide what to do. My mind raced with possibilities. Were they waiting for me to step outside? Was this some kind of setup? Before I could spiral any further, flashing blue and red lights lit up the lot. The police had arrived. They pulled in behind the car, blocking it in. I watched as 2 officers approached cautiously. The driver's door opened, and the man from earlier stepped out, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. The passenger followed suit. Both men were quickly detained without much of a scene. What happened next, though, shook me to my core. After searching the car, the officers discovered a disturbing array of items in the trunk. Weapons, rope, tape, and other supplies that made my stomach churn. This wasn't just an attempted robbery. They were prepared for something far worse. Both men were arrested on the spot, and the police later told me they'd likely planned to abduct someone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. If I hadn't reported their suspicious behavior, if the police hadn't arrived when they did, I might not have made it through the night. Even now, months later, I can't shake the memory. The thought of what could have happened keeps me awake some nights. Working at that gas station seemed like a simple solution to my financial troubles, but it almost cost me everything. I used to work at my dad's restaurant when I was in my late teens. It was a regular local place, Not too fancy, just a cozy spot for people to grab a meal or takeout. The restaurant stayed open until 2 a.m. every night. During high school, I'd work after school until about 8, but once I graduated, I started taking on the late-night closing shifts to save up for college. Surprisingly, the restaurant would stay fairly busy at night, right up until closing. Most of the late-night customers were picking up online orders, but occasionally, groups of friends would come in and hang out at one of the tables while they ate. I didn't mind working nights, though. In fact, I preferred it. I was usually the only one there, and I didn't have to deal with my dad bossing me around. For the first 6 months, everything was uneventful. It was routine, clean up, handle a few orders, lock up, and go home. But then, things started to get weird. It was a typical night, nearing closing time around 1:45 a.m. I was in the back cleaning up when I heard the distinct chime of the front door. It was unusual for someone to come in so late, but I figured it was just a last-minute customer. I finished up what I was doing and made my way to the front counter. There were 2 young men. They both looked exhausted, disheveled, like they hadn't slept in days. One of them approached the counter while the other lingered near one of the tables. I forced a polite smile and said, "Our dining room is closed for the night, but I can still take a small order for takeout if you'd like." The man at the counter didn't respond. He just stared at the menu, as if he were lost in thought. The silence stretched, and I started feeling uncomfortable. Then he shifted his gaze to something behind me, scanning the restaurant like he was looking for something or someone. The second man, the one near the table, suddenly walked out the door without a word. A moment later, the man at the counter turned and followed him. The door chime echoed again as they left. I stood there for a long moment, frozen. Something about the encounter felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. My gut told me they had been up to something, possibly planning to rob me, but for whatever reason, they'd decided against it. The next morning, I told my dad about what had happened. He wasn't thrilled but suggested I start locking the doors around 1:45 to avoid any late-night trouble. A week passed without incident, and I began to think I'd overreacted. Then it happened again. It was around 1:30 a.m., and a customer was picking up an order. As soon as they left, the door chime rang again. I looked up and felt a chill run down my spine. It was one of the men from the previous week, the one who had stood by the table. I recognized him immediately, not just because of his face, but because he was wearing the exact same clothes. Something about that made the situation even creepier. This time, he walked straight up to the counter. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a second before finally speaking. "Can you help me jumpstart my car?" The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. His tone was off, too deliberate, too forced. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. "Sorry," I said quickly. "I'm not allowed to leave the restaurant during my shift." His expression darkened instantly. His friendly facade melted away, replaced by something cold and menacing. "It'll only take a minute," he insisted, his voice growing more assertive. "No one has to know you left." I could feel my pulse quickening. My hands shook as I gripped the counter. I couldn't see his partner, but I was certain he was nearby, waiting for the right moment. The man gestured toward the door, motioning for me to follow him. I didn't move. My mind raced, weighing my options. I wasn't big or strong, and this guy easily had the advantage. If his friend was nearby, I didn't stand a chance. But if I followed him, I might not come back. My adrenaline kicked in. Without thinking, I grabbed a pair of scissors from behind the counter and held them in front of me. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The man turned back toward me, and his expression shifted again, this time to anger. "Come on," he demanded, his voice low and threatening. Before I could respond, a loud bang erupted from the back of the restaurant. It sounded like someone trying to break in through the back door. My heart jumped into my throat. The back door slammed open, and I bolted toward it instinctively. As I reached the back room, I saw a figure fleeing into the night. The door swung shut behind him, leaving me standing there, gasping for breath. I turned and ran back to the front, but the man at the counter was gone. The parking lot outside was empty. They had vanished. I immediately called the police, shaking as I explained what had happened. They arrived quickly and reviewed the security footage, but the quality was poor. The men's faces were blurry, their identities impossible to make out. To this day, I'm not entirely sure what their plan was. Maybe they intended to rob the restaurant. Maybe they had something worse in mind. All I know is that they were persistent and dangerous. If I hadn't stood my ground, the night could have ended very differently. I still think about it sometimes, especially late at night. The sound of the door chime haunts me, a reminder of how close I came to something far worse than a robbery. This happened just last month while I was still living at my previous condo. It was part of a complex with 4 connected units, and I was renting the 4th. The place was relatively quiet, nestled in a suburban neighborhood where people mostly kept to themselves. I worked from home, and one day around noon, while I was taking a break, the doorbell rang. It startled me a little since I wasn't expecting anyone. I went to the door and opened it to find a young woman standing there. She was small and skinny, wearing ripped jeans and a tank top. Her hair looked unkempt, and she had a nervous energy about her. I waited for her to say something, but she just stood there, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. After a couple of awkward seconds, I finally asked, "Can I help you?" She blinked and then asked, "Are you the only one living here?" The way she said it threw me off. There was something strange in her tone, like she was surprised to see me or confused that I was even there. Still, I answered, "Yes, I live alone." She nodded quickly and muttered, "Sorry, I must have the wrong address." Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked away. I stood at the door for a moment, watching her disappear down the path. It felt odd, but I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just one of those weird encounters that didn't mean anything. I went back to work and didn't think much more about it. Later that evening, around 8, I went to the supermarket to pick up some groceries. When I got back to my condo, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately hit by a strange feeling. Something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but there was this heavy unease settling in my chest. I brushed it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination after the encounter earlier. I went about my routine, putting away the groceries and starting to cook dinner. The kitchen was small but cozy, and the rhythmic sounds of chopping vegetables and boiling water helped me relax. But just as I started to let my guard down, I heard a faint noise coming from down the hallway. I froze, gripping the kitchen counter. All the doors in the hallway were closed, and the sound was subtle, like a soft creak or shuffle. My mind immediately tried to rationalize it. It's just the upstairs neighbor, I told myself. The walls are thin. It has to be them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the noise had come from inside my condo. I strained my ears, but everything was silent again. After a few moments, I forced myself to continue cooking, determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. I finished making my food and sat at the small dining table to eat. The condo was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the refrigerator. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a door opening. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound was clear and unmistakable, and it was coming from inside my condo. My heart pounded as I stood up from the table. I held my breath, listening intently. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, they echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. I was frozen in place, unable to move as the steps approached the kitchen. A man appeared at the end of the hallway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look at me. He just walked past me, as if I weren't even there. My mind raced, What's happening? Who is this? What do I do? He continued toward the front door, opened it, and walked out without a single word. The moment the door closed behind him, I snapped out of my paralysis. I ran to the door and locked it, my hands shaking so badly that I struggled with the latch. Then, I bolted to the bathroom and locked myself in. I sat there on the cold tile floor, heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. I knew the man was gone, but I couldn't shake the fear that he might come back. Eventually, I called the police. When they arrived, I recounted everything I could remember, but my description of the man was vague at best. I'd only seen him for a moment, and he hadn't even looked at me. The officers searched the condo and found no signs of forced entry. That was the most unsettling part. It meant the man must have had a key. The police questioned my neighbors, but none of them had seen or heard anything unusual. I told them about the young woman who had come by earlier in the day and how strange the encounter had been. It felt like more than a coincidence, like she might have been involved, perhaps scoping out the place before sending him in. What disturbed me even more was that only a few small items were missing, amounting to less than $100 in total. It made no sense. If the man had gone through the trouble of getting inside, why hadn't he taken more? The thought crept into my mind that maybe he wasn't there to rob me at all. Maybe he'd been planning something far worse but changed his mind when I came home. I moved out of that condo within weeks. Even now, in my new place, I find myself double-checking the locks and glancing over my shoulder. It's been a month since it happened, but the fear hasn't left me. The not knowing is the worst part, who they were, how they got in, and what they really wanted. It's something I'll probably carry with me for the rest of my life.